Thank you everyone for coming. This is our brainstorming and sharing session, the first one for 2023. We've been doing it for the last, this is the third year now, and I'm happy to say that there's always different topics. And the topic for today is culture as a goal, right? As a guidance for everyone, this is a place where we can listen into various perspectives on integrating heritage and sustainable development. It is a place to create a shared base of knowledge, to level off ideas, principles, and align actions. We don't see anything wrong in these ideas. You can say anything that you feel like you agree or disagree, that is fine. This is a place to also co-create ideas and learn and share knowledge. It's meant to be a small group, but now it's like a big group of 35 people and coming to more, and that's fine. And then it is an informal space, so we can have a lot of different conversations to share these views. But do note that this will be shared in YouTube, and as I said earlier. So I just wanted to highlight where this is coming from. So as you probably know, the SDGs Working Group has 9 task teams, and one of the task teams looks at the engagement at the UN High-Level Political Forum and what we call as the Culture 2030 Goal Campaign. And I will explain that a little bit more. Every brainstorming session is linked to some kind of work that we do. And if you see any work that is interesting for you, do let me know as well. And let's see how you can be part of that team or do some brainstorming session with regards to the topic. Our task team 2, which I mentioned earlier about the UN High-Level Political Forum and the Culture 2030 Goal Campaign, is really looking at how ICOMOS engages at this platform, which is the place where people engage for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this usually happens in July. So every year they meet in New York. And this task team is the one who responds to that call for the UN for sustainable development reporting. We are also a part of the NGO major group that we provide inputs to what are perspectives of NGOs in the bigger picture of sustainable development, depending on what SDG is being discussed. And another topic is the Culture 2030 goal, which I will share a little bit more later. This task team also engages on discussions on, let's say, the UN process. So this year, our colleagues from the ISC Water and in the ISC on underwater cultural heritage is part of this team because they're campaigning for SDG 6 to be discussed in March for the UN as well. For task team 2, we have been having some recent activities, and I would like to share as well that the biggest one that we did was last year in Mondecote. We were in Mexico with some colleagues and with a partnership with the Mexican government, the Ministry of Culture. We also had a partnership with the ICOMOS Mexico as well. Recently, I was fortunate enough to be called by UNDESA and the UN Habitat to look at SDG 11 and how we can contribute to that. So we have this target 11.4 that I'm sure that some of you have also contributed to the points that has been shared there, and I will share more on what has been discussed in SDG 11 at another platform. There is an incoming work that is happening for the G20. So ICOMOS is part of what we call as the G20 Culture Working Group. And this work is happening in, this year it's in India. So there's a series of conversations on the topic of heritage and culture. And we are part of that conversation. Earlier, I mentioned about the UN 2023 Water Conference that will happen in New York, where we're supporting the IC Water and the underwater cultural heritage for the advocacy for SDG 6. And then, of course, we will also have that discussion on the high-level political forum and so on. So these are just some of the things that we will be doing. Now, for the Culture 2030 goal campaign, oops, sorry, I'm skipping slides. Our topic for today is culture as a goal, but to give a little bit of background on our involvement in this. So in 2014, ICOMOS was became part of this coalition of cultural organizations. We are one of 7 organizations that are part of this group, and one of our colleagues here who will be presenting is Stephen Wyber, who's part of the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and they're also one of our members to the campaign. Last year, we had a discussion with UCLG with Jordi Pascual, who is also part of that campaign. There are other organizations like the International Music Council, Arterial Network, and the culture. Stephen, you have to give me the other ones. The Culture Action Europe, right? And I might be missing 1 or 2. I can't remember. But there is a coalition of different cultural organizations. Now, what has happened last year is we've been progressing with the different kinds of work to emphasize the role of culture in the SDGs. If you're familiar with Target 11.4, we are, heritage is part of that sustainable cities target. But we recognize that there is a missing link of where is culture in the SDGs. Now, the campaign has created a document which I've shared in my email, and these are some of the snippets of why we believe that there needs to be a dedicated goal for culture after the 2030 agenda. But of course, we should not say that it should be happening in the future. We should also think about what it means now. And this conversation that we're having is really about that. How do we think culture is part of the SDGs? Do we think that it needs a different goal, a separate goal in itself? Or is it an all-encompassing, let's say, implicit part of the discussion of the SDGs? Then that's the time to debate. Here are just potential targets. Look at the link that will be given to you, or I'll give it to you later, but these are potential targets that we've identified, summarized it, and let me know if you agree or disagree, or do you think that there are other ways of crafting these measures. We have 3 discussants for today. Mike Turner, who's here from, who's a UNESCO Chair, Stephen Wyber from the IFLA, as I mentioned, and our colleague Ananya Bhattacharya, who will be looking at the intangible cultural heritage and the perspective of sustainable development. What I'll do, I'll stop sharing here, and then I'll give the floor to Mike first, and then he can share a little bit of what he thinks. And we will continue with the 3 presentations, and from there we can have a discussion. But if you have any questions to the presenters, do voice it out in the chat, and then we can take that later on as a full-on discussion. Before I give him the floor, I also want to highlight that at the end of it, there will be a small presentation by our colleague Emmett Hither, who is also introducing herself as a new member of the SDGs Working Group. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Gabe, for putting us into putting everything into a format. And I see Ege here, and I think we should all support. And we're all shocked as the evolving situation which is happening in southern Turkey and northern Syria are really, really something which is touching our hearts. And I know that Ege was very much involved in the in part of the conservation in the city there by that epicenter. I'm just going to open up with some thoughts which we've had. And I'm just going to look at 3 documents, that of the historic urban landscape, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the New Urban Agenda as relevant for our discussion. I put them in this order because that was their chronological evolution. And the historic urban landscape recommendation evolved from the Vienna Memorandum 2005 right up to 2011. And during that time, there was the issue of how culture contributes to development. And what we're already at that time that we actually looked at the transformation of urban communities has been a major issue. And what we spoke about previously about mobility and speed of change is now is even more rapid than we even thought about. So let's look really what sustainable development is. And I'm saying is that we need to rethink what might take place after 2030. The Brundtland definition, if we're seeing exactly what culture is relating to sustainable development, spoke about needs and limitations by state of technology. Mrs. Brundtland would have had no idea of what ChatGPT is doing to us, and only then 30 years ago. So I think that one of the most critical things which we actually look at is what David Reed has always said, is that it's very unmeaningful to talk of sustainable development when we have no certainty of the needs of future generations. So it rather challenges this issue of being able to understand about the future generations, and perhaps we would say that innovation is necessity is the mother of invention. I think that one of the most important things I want to speak about in this short presentation is that culture as an enabler development and culture as a driver. I think we have to begin to understand that. I think our most important text which we can use is that of Amartya Sen, which spoke about the connections between culture and economic development. It was really very, very critical, and I won't go into the details of it. So we've got then direct references, which we're looking at, which is in fact, everybody speaks about goal 11 and the target 11.4. Specific references are to 4, 8, and 12, where there's cultural diversity, local culture, and local culture. And at that point, essentially, it promotes local culture and products in 8 and 12. In 4 is the culture of peace and nonviolence. And Gabe actually highlighted this in his opening slide. We also have indirect references in 3, 9, 13, 15, and 17, which Egger has actually presented to us in previous years, and which are really very critical. But this makes us to think that we cannot put ourselves in a box. And therefore, one of the things, it's not just we can't put ourselves, but nobody can put ourselves in a box. And what we need to do in the 2030 is to encourage people to move out of their silos and create a much more formula for integrative activities. The other thing which I want to speak about is to say that there is the goal of 11, but to highlight what I say, people have heard me say before, that the 11.4 is a target to achieve a goal. In other words, it's to protect and safeguard heritage, to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Well, this is a very, very different thing of seeing culture as a goal and seeing culture as a means to an end. A lot of us were involved in this culture urban future, which was the basis for the new urban agenda. And the new urban agenda is really full of culture. But I want to make the differentiation between culture as a noun and cultural as an adjective. So in the culture, we have then new urban agenda recognizes that culture should be taken into account, will include culture as a priority component. I mean, this is just marching orders. How new the urban agenda is, I'm not too sure, but nevertheless, culture and cultural diversity are the sources of enrichment. And when we look at it, there's two critical changes which are put out, is they have social, economic, and environmental sustainability. They actually don't speak about culture, they speak about spatial sustainability. In other words, sustainability not just between time, but between place, topos and chronos. The other things about means of implementation, culture appears in soft measures. That's all, but together with technology and innovation. And in the new urban agenda, it appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 times as culture as a noun. When it's a noun, it's a driver for sustainable development. It's a source of enrichment, production patterns, culture as a key element of humanization, promote affordable access to culture. All these are within as a noun in the New Urban Agenda. But if you look at the New Urban Agenda as culture as an adjective, cultural, we will see cultural interactions, cultural development, cultural diversity, cultural expressions, cultural contribution. I won't go through the whole things, but there are 17 different adjectives used in cultural representation. And here it is only an enabler of development. I would then say, is looking at the Mondial cult, where in fact people adopted, let's have a specific objective in its own right. I think we have to then temper this. I'm not convinced. Perhaps for UNESCO that's important. For us in ICOMOS, I don't think that that is where we want to be. I think we've got other things which we actually want to be able to do. And in the call to action of the Mondial cult, there was in fact from 9 to 18 were the call for action of what needs to be done. Most of them, to my mind, are not relevant for an individual goal, but they're very, very relevant to add to other goals. I'm going to leave you with this thought. And this was work which was done by Desine and others. And I think that it puts together exactly the issues which are together. We don't use the word pillars, that came later. These are spheres. So the roles of the culture are therefore is culture in sustainable development, culture for sustainability, and then culture as sustainable development. In other words, the embracing of culture within the whole aspect. So I think there's room for all places. But I think that what we need to ensure is that culture as sustainable development is high on the agenda. Over.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's very, very good. The idea, I mean, we always say that the culture is a driver and an enabler of sustainable development. And I think that's very good that Mike is differentiating that, you know, how does heritage, or how does it really, what does it really mean? But I think what we can decide later on is this 3 spheres that Mike has shared, and we can debate on that more a little bit later. Okay, so now good. We can move on to Stephen, and then he can share another perspective on what is culture is about. Stephen, please.
Thank you very much. That's working. You can hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to go without a PowerPoint to keep things a bit more sort of informal and hopefully stick to my 15 minutes properly. So very briefly, just to introduce myself and IFLA, because I'm conscious that we come from a different branch of the cultural world. I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy at IFLA. I come from a generalist perspective, more of a political science perspective. So I'd be aware that's likely to colour the perspectives and the ideas that I share in this one. I hope I won't say anything too crude. IFLA itself is effectively, it is ICOMOS's sister organisation when it comes to libraries of all sorts. We slightly predate, we're not part of the sort of 1947 round of creation of major international cultural networks. We date back to 1927, but in many ways the role is the same, bringing people together, providing both a space within the sector for promoting professional practice, promoting ideas, innovation, support, but also for engaging internationally in trying to get others outside our sector to see the role of libraries as being important. Just talk briefly about the role of libraries in this and how we see things. I think one challenge that we have, and one reason why I think sometimes we get a bit jealous of those working within ICOMOS, is that libraries tend to be incredibly generalist institutions, and they are in the cultural realm, they're often in the educational realm, they're often in the research realm. Within our sector, we have people who are institutions that are answering to cultural ministries, but also to education ministries, to local government, to research ministries. We have those that are working within government as well. A lot of our members are government libraries, parliamentary libraries too. So there's an interesting line in there, and I think that makes it a that gives an interesting perspective on this, because we're both talking about, there is traditional, high culture. So the work that libraries do in order to maintain crucial works of imagination, crucial, the things that hold us together, the fuel for social cohesion. But at the same time, there's also a lot of what we're doing is nonetheless is built around the communities. So rather than starting with the collection, the doctrine, if we can call that, is built very much around, well, what is it that our communities, what is it that the cultural, as in the way of living of our communities actually requires, and the logic that certainly that's applied in a lot of libraries. You take that's the starting point, and you build your collections, you build your activities around that. I think that makes things interesting, because then you do have both as two facets of culture. So culture as artistic creation, but also culture as the way that we live, and the assumptions and the beliefs and the values that actually motivate us, that determine our behaviors. So that gives quite an interesting angle to follow in this. So in my speech, I'm going to cover three, potentially controversial statements. I don't know, but given that this is supposed to trigger some brainstorming. So firstly, just to underline, I'm going to talk first about how mainstreaming is hard. And that it's not something that comes naturally to many of us. It certainly doesn't come naturally to governments. I'm then going to talk a little bit about how we see the 2030 agenda as having let us down and having taken a direction that is suboptimal. And then I'm going to end by talking a little bit about why success is hard, and why, if we get what we want, it's not going to be easy either. And I think you've already talked a little bit about the Culture 2030 goals, so I don't need to campaign, so I don't need to talk too much about that. So on that first point, why mainstream is hard, and I think that this is where, I know my own background into broader political science and work across different policy areas comes in, because there are lots of issues out there that we know are important. We know that gender equality is important. We know that equality in general is important. We know that tackling climate change is important. And so there are so many initiatives out there that say, well, the way to get this into other processes is by adding in a stage. So for example, whenever a government carries out its impact assessment, what is the impact of this decision? How can we make sure that we're not taking decisions that are bad for equality, that are bad for the environment, or whatever else? There's it's a little tick box they've got to look through, and they've got to at some point write a sentence of saying, we have thought about the impact of this decision on this, and this is what we think. The problem is, when you do that, people just get, these things are not properly filled in. There's not sufficient thinking when you try and mainstream. And that's kind of normal, because it's not normal to expect a stressed official who's trying to write a law, who's trying to take decisions, to think about everything. So it's not an easy thing. It really isn't an easy thing to do. This isn't to say, of course, that it isn't something that needs to be focused on. And I think actually one of the interesting things in the SDGs, and that I think doesn't get focused on enough, is the fact that actually with the goals, it's supposed to be an integral block. It's supposed to be a whole. And those of you who participated in these sorts of events, I don't know, it's people go along, it's like, I don't know, it's the Eurovision Song Contest. It's people turning up and trying to say how their goal is the most important. And so the number of meetings you go to with utterly insane discussions about how, I don't know, is animal welfare or education more important than the other, and people trying to lobby each other. That's, I don't know, it's a waste of time. But I think also it misses the point that with the SDGs, the whole point is to talk about development as a whole, that we need to take that sort of comprehensive approach. I don't feel that that's been necessarily taken up as well as it should have been. I know that within the UN, those people who are behind the agenda certainly think that should be in there. We've seen some really good work from the cultural community, from the scientific community, to look at those interlinkages and look at those connections, which is super helpful. But I think, I don't know, we're not there yet. It's something that it feels like the UN is trying to go back to again when as part of its sort of halfway check-in on the SDGs, on trying to look at our common agenda and the summit for the future that's coming up next year. But it's not a given. Simply by saying we should mainstream culture, simply by trying to say, well, there should be a tick box in every impact assessment or a necessary stage in every bit of decision making to say, have you considered culture? Have you integrated people from the cultural sector? That's not going to be an easy thing. In terms of why, coming on to the second point about how the 2030 agenda has let us down, I really recommend, next to the Culture 2030 Goal Zero draft document that was launched at Mondiacult last year, there's a really fantastic bit of work by John Crowley. He was our consultant on this, and he did a great bit of analysis on what happened. Why was it that culture was not featured as an agenda, that culture was not featured as a specific goal in the document that was agreed in 2015. And I really encourage you to look at it. I think there's some interesting discussion there about the nature of things and the risks. The approach that was taken. There's arguably probably a bit of focus on the steps or missteps that were taken in trying to promote the idea of a cultural goal from UNESCO in particular. The idea that what didn't work was an effort purely focused on a sector. A goal that focuses only on the culture sector was out of line with what was being done elsewhere, as you don't have goals focused on the interests of purely an industrial sector or so on, and everything is focused on actually what is the goal, what's actually being changed on the ground. I think there was this idea, and terribly noble, but probably over optimistic, that by being mainstreamed, something would happen. But this ran into the issue that I set out, that mainstreaming is so often just dilution. And it's also kind of crazy because you could argue that climate change is something that should apply across the board, and education is something that should apply across the board, but it's almost impossible to imagine an agenda without those as specific goals. I think also, as I said, one of the challenges with the SDGs has been that there is that focus on the cost cutting in there. It's not as if, though, a lot of people have bought into it, and certainly the way that discussion, the follow-up to the SDGs, the monitoring has been structured, has been focused around individual goals. The way that things work, there are the meeting that Gabe just mentioned in Bilbao. It's a meeting focused on SDG 11. There will be sessions at the high-level political forum, the big sort of jamboree that happens every year. They're not really focused so much on cost-cutting factors. They're focused on individual goals that are in there. So again, we see the cost of, if you mainstream, you lose that focus. I think there's also, and the result of this is therefore that we don't have an entry point in New York in the same way. I think that's also valid, and this is probably the sort of my generalist perspective coming in. It's not magical that UNESCO says that culture is important. That's not really a win. An organization with the word culture in its name saying that culture is important is in England would say, is the Pope Catholic? It's pretty obvious. And so I don't think we need to, there's no magic in that. What we need is to get that way in with the generalists. And it's a logic that certainly we try to apply in our advocacy in the library field, is that, the people who should be supporting you should be supporting you. What you need to do is diversify your support base. You need to find that way to get the health guys and the education guys and the climate guys and so on actually being our cheerleaders and having this diverse support base for what we're doing. And at the moment, if we don't have that way in New York, and we don't have equivalent ways in discussions at the national level, that's not going to work so well. So, and yeah, by trying to mainstream culture, by not including a culture goal, the 2030 agenda has just, it's let us down. It's not provided that way in. The third sort of statement I was going to throw at you is how success is going to be hard, because I think we should be careful. We should be aware of what we're getting ourselves into. It is comfortable to be just in our own field. It's comfortable to be just one policy area focusing on quite a specific set of goals. It's comforting to think that we are an end in ourselves. And I know that Michael sort of alluded to this one, and this is one of those areas where I'm conscious I may misspeak or say something horrible. But I think there's a problem that culture as an end in itself works for people who get that, but it's a little bit like the people who try to convert you to their religion on the street. If you don't already believe that, then you're not going to be convinced by someone telling you to do it on the street. I think we do need to, without losing our focus, without losing our integrity, that there has to be an understanding that, well, if we want other people to support us, if we want to be properly integrated, we need to learn to speak their language, and we need to learn to articulate the contribution that we can make in language, in terms, in values that make sense to them. And actually, this is something we found has been helpful within the library field, is saying that, well, regardless of the labels or the numbers or the pretty logos or whatever with the SDGs, this sort of framework is a really helpful thought tool, because it forces us to think not in terms of the things that we do as our goals, but thinking in terms of what are society's measures of success and how can we contribute to them. Now, if we get success and if culture does get better recognized as a goal, I think there is then that pressure to say, well, if we are part of an integrated whole, then we need to think as part of an integrated whole. We need to avoid cultural imperialism. And I know that means another thing in a different context, but it's a bit like there's already the concept of economic imperialism, where everything is about economics and everything can be explained by economics. If we do the same from culture, or chauvinism, exactly. So, but cultural chauvinism in terms of like, we are the answer to everything. And I think the problem is if we do that, we risk looking like the street preachers, who and we just get lost. I don't know, we lose people, because the world is full of people telling you that they have the solution to everything. I don't know, we need to think, and we need to use frameworks like the SDGs, like what comes next, to flip around and think about, well, how are we delivering what's helpful? I'm conscious that then I've only got a couple more minutes until my 15 minutes is up. I think there's also an interesting angle and something that we need to think about. What does it look like, and what does it mean for us if, when policies and strategies are being made, that we are properly involved? Because it's not like we are a rich sector. We don't have armies of lobbyists. We don't have armies of public affairs people to do our job. What does it look like when the cultural sector, and in particular, the fact that the cultural sector should be well attuned to the ways of living and the belief systems and the behaviors of people on the ground? What does it look like to actually get us involved? Now, I'm fascinated to, I don't know, there are some really good examples out there, especially at the local level, at the urban level, of really listening to that and thinking about that. There's an interesting question about how do we systematize that? How do we make that into a systemic thing? And how much work there is, given that we've also all got day jobs to be following. And that's a sort of, I know, it's a key thing we should be looking at. And then I think, yes, you've already covered the Culture 2030 goal campaign. I suppose just if I needed to characterize it quickly, that we're both about trying to be a goal in the future, without presupposing what the format of any future development agenda might be. But I think crucially to be seen as a goal now, that to some extent we are about faking it till we make it. I don't know, it is a fake it till you make it kind of approach. I don't know, we need to use the momentum that we have coming out of Mondiacult in order to try and get governments to see, well, actually, no, we should act as if culture is a goal, just as we act as education is a goal, in order to get that recognition, to get that involvement, to make sure that we're not missing opportunities mobilize the sector, to deliver on the value of culture, full stop, and to listen to what those needs actually are. So yeah, I will stop there because it'll be, I don't know, the brainstorm is going to be interesting.
Thanks, Stephen. So there was a lot of points there which are very, very helpful, which is good. I think you've given us a lot of different perspectives. I think from the heritage perspective, we are part of that idea that you said it's two aspects, right? The creation and the creativity, and then the way that we live. And heritage mostly is looking at the way that we live, about the monuments and all. But there's a whole other sector of the artists, the creatives who we should also celebrate. And that is why it is important to look at it holistically, right? And I do agree that for the 3 points that you said, success is difficult, and convincing other people who don't speak your language on why is it relevant, but not necessarily looking like, as you said, the beggar in this, not the beggar, that person in the street that says that advocates for something, and understanding how other people can react to that is quite important. So let's hear the feedback. I'm seeing a lot of discussions on the chat, and we will discuss more later. So let's have Ananya and her perspective coming from intangible heritage and practices.
So namaskar and good evening to all of you. From Kolkata in India, Gabriel had asked a question that how important culture is in your daily practice. Next, please. So I thought of sharing a little bit about my city. You know, my city, Kolkata, is the cultural capital of India. It's called the cultural capital of India. And just to give you an idea of how important culture is in this city, which is known for its theater, film, music, food, arts. We just had the 46th International Book Fair, which ended last Sunday. And it saw a footfall in 2 weeks of 2.6 million people, talk of book lovers, and a sales of $3 million US. In 2021, we got our biggest festival in the city, Durga Puja in Kolkata, that got inscribed in the UNESCO representative list. And a study by British Council says that per the study done in 2019, that the creative industries around this festival leads to economic value of around $4.5 billion US, and it contributes to nearly 2.5% of the state's GDP, just 5 days of festival. So, you know, that is the power of culture which reverberates, and we feel it all the time. Next, and also I wear the hat of a development organization who uses culture and development, and we're doing this since 2000. So we started in a very small way with a pilot with 3,000 folk artists way back in 2004. We call it Art for Life, which focuses on empowering rural traditional artists and craftspeople to safeguard their ICH, develop the villages as, you know, vibrant cultural hubs where people visit, and promotes cultural diversity. We do international festivals regularly. The Sur Jahan, you see a photo here, it's a festival going on since 2011, and more than 35 countries have participated. And the main aim and objective is, you know, to celebrate diversity, to celebrate different cultures. Next, please. So in our journey of past 20 years, we have seen that, of course, you know, the economic aspect, if we do a heritage sensitive commercialization, if we just consider the economic aspect, if we open up the markets, then the young people pursue, the viability improves, sustainability improves, since we are talking of indicators today. So these are some of the indicators which we have followed, you know, how the skill transmission ecosystem got rebuilt, how the access to culture, how recognition and pride increased, because the marginalized communities whom no one knew about, their art forms or culture no one knew about, are now respected, recognized, felicitated. And one thing which happened was, you know, the ownership on overall SDGs increased in the communities. So along with the culture-specific, cultural industry or social inclusion-specific indicators, we also saw the younger generation pursuing higher education, sanitation improving, health improving, women empowerment happening. So this has been really the learning of our journey, and we have been involved in this discourse on including culture since Hangzhou, and some of the disappointments which my earlier speakers discussed and said, we have felt that, you know, when the SDG, next please, when the SDG 2030, 2015 was set, we realized that, you know, culture really did not find the place we were all aspiring for. As an NGO working on ICH, we also are part of this global family of ICH NGO forum. And I also wanted to share, you know, how culture gives you the voice and a way to, way for advocacy. You know, during the Ukraine war, all the NGOs during Easter, they use this, they all posted, you know, these painted eggs. Paisansky is a tradition of Ukraine. And as some of you may be aware, UNESCO also called an emergency session and inscribed the washed cooking of Ukraine. So these are some of the important soft powers which culture has. Next, please. So, you know, when we are discussing today that whether culture needs its own goal, I think we need to, as of course, you know, my earlier speakers have spoken in the same lines, we need to think of this power of culture. You know, we are all talking, UNESCO is saying, we are also saying that culture is a public good. And we are talking about the soft power of culture. So when we talk of culture as a fourth pillar, and as an organization working on culture and development, it is something we all really want. But we need to really discuss how this fourth goal can be shared, so that, as they were saying, we are facing so many challenges, right? Disasters, armed conflicts, climate change. So where can culture find a place, you know, in the development world? Next, please. So if we look at the UNESCO thematic indicators for culture, you see, broadly, all the indicators, they are touching on what Mike said. Culture is now like cultural facilities, open space for culture, culture in GDP, cultural employment. That is, of course, the adjective part, cultural knowledge. So this is a quite nice framework, which is talking how across the SDGs, you know, culture can appear as an indicator. Next, please. We recently had the Mondial Cult discussion. And in Mondial Cult also, we see when the key points are being discussed, and Mike also discussed this, we have been talking of illicit trafficking prevention. We have been talking of having a World Forum of Cultural Policies. And some of the key points are related to artistic freedom, intellectual property, legal and public policy framework, all very specific to cultural policies domain. My take is that, you know, when we are talking of culture as a fourth goal, we need to expand and go beyond the realm of cultural policies. Next, please. And I'll take from where exactly Mike ended, culture as sustainable development. Last year, we worked with around 17 indigenous communities living in the northeastern state of India called Arunachal Pradesh. And these communities, we realized, are like living schools of sustainability. And there was so much we learned, you know, how they're still practicing natural resource management, agricultural practices, food adaptations, and all these need to come into the discourse. Till date, our discourse has been largely creative industry, creative economy, cultural rights, artistic freedom. But I think culture as sustainable development is what we can use to draw global attention on the importance of culture as a fourth pillar. Next, please. I'll give you a few examples. There is a community called Puroik. And they, they use flour made from the bark of a sago palm tree, and they make pancakes from that. And these are very remote areas, and they're often cut off due to rain and snow. And then they survive on this food. So we have this kind of indigenous knowledge across the world, which can provide solution to some of the food challenges we face. Next, please. Most of the food of the indigenous communities are from backward biodiversity. Even if you look at their lifestyle, they have this principle of zero wastage. They do not use industrial produce, and their buildings are climatologically very efficient. But what is happening in our modern housing policies? We are not supporting building of these traditional architecture. As a result, if they want to build a new house to get a loan from the bank, they can't make that house anymore, and they will have to go for a brick and tin kind of building. So I think these are the areas where, we need to say that culture, have a focus on local culture, local tradition, local knowledge, and see that the policies are integrating them. Next, please. Some of the communities said we live in bamboo and dive in bamboo. They use bamboo and cane. See this lovely backpack. So all their tools are of enormous value. Now, in today's world, traditional knowledge and craft, we often talk about aesthetic part of it. But I think the contribution of traditional craft, to a sustainable lifestyle, to a sustainable way of life, if there is a bigger focus, if there is a bigger investment, then a lot of problems like plastic pollution and waste management, all these can be addressed. Next, please. The most important learning which our indigenous communities across the world, they are still having, is the knowledge of biocultural diversity. When we are talking of cultural goals, we are talking of cultural diversity, right? But I think we need to expand our discourse and talk of biocultural diversity, because it is how is it defined? It is the diversity of life in all its manifestations, biological as well as cultural. And there is a strong linkage within a complex socio-ecological adaptive system. And if we research and understand and study biocultural diversity, we'll understand how people have adapted with nature, and the cultural landscapes which we cherish, they show how biological and cultural value of the environment grows from practice, action, and behavior. So these are photos from Zero Valley, which is in the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which shows how this community called Apatani, they have systemic land use practices and traditional ecological knowledge. So when we are talking of life on earth, when we are talking of life on the ocean, the community's traditional knowledge is of importance, which we really need to look into, because historically these cultural landscapes have shown the harmonious relationship between nature and culture. So in these goal settings, the culture needs to be incorporated. Even in urban landscape analysis, we look at biodiversity in the ecosystem. But usually we look in the spatial sense as it was shared. But we now also need to look into narratives in relation to socio-cultural groups and their practices. I think this is a very important area which must prominently feature in the discourse. Next, please. Another thing, and as ICTC, I'm also here in the SDG Working Group. I'm representing the ICTC also. And in ICTC, we have been working on the commons approach on polycentric governance. This example I'm sharing is again from Arunachal, where a community, they're called Bugun. A species of bird was discovered, Bugun leocicla, in late 90s. And they actually donated a land of 17 square kilometers, which is a community-led biodiversity reserve. It is called the Village Community Reserve Forest. And this is to protect the red panda, the Bugun leocicla. So, these things are beyond cultural policies, but it is extremely important. And we have such examples all across the world. So, as Dinu was saying, and also as Stephen was saying, when lots of issues are being debated, often culture does not get priority. But if we position our arguments and build these evidences, I think there will be scope of greater recognition of the importance of culture. Next, please. Another series of webinars we did on COVID, during COVID, was from ICOMOS India and our National Scientific Committee on Historic Towns and Villages, where we discussed on sustainable and resilient development of heritage areas and precincts. And through a year-long series of webinars, we had 7 webinars altogether covering diverse aspects. It was very evident that, our urban planning has been historically very closely linked to the nature and environment. And traditional wisdom always had an understanding of local context and had a holistic approach. Suddenly, in the past few decades, we are seeing suddenly we have this culture of, rebuilding. So we need to make a paradigm shift and relearn from heritage. So this is another huge area, I think, where, I don't know whether it will be culture as noun. I think it will be culture as verb there, right? Where we need to have culture more strongly, articulated, and the advocacy needs to highlight these. Next, please. So I'll take, all of you were aware, last year, as ICOMOS, we adopted the International Cultural Heritage Tourism Charter. And this is a wonderful example of how, a charter can integrate natural and cultural heritage values. It has 7 principles. And in these 7 principles, we are all talking about community, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about climate action. So this charter is a wonderful example of, how we can, as ICOMOS, we can influence policymaking, we can influence practices. And this is kind of a deliberate design for self-organization, right? So as an ICOMOS forum, I think we need to have such concrete approaches to influence the discourse and the discussion so that, in the decision-making process, it's very important that the community actually participates, right? And such charters are very strong and powerful tools. Next, please. So when we are talking of culture as 4th pillar, to summarize, we have to go beyond cultural policy making. In Mondia Cult, we just spoke of having a series of world forums on cultural policies, but we need to really stop talking of just cultural policies, and instead we need to engage multiple stakeholders using a transversal approach and show how culture can offer smarter solution for SDG. Again, going back to the example of our own organization, when whatever fund we have received till date for work has been from MSME department, from tourism department. Here you see in the deserts of Rajasthan, they're developing the villages as destinations and how the community were traditional musicians, they're singing for the audience, right? So, tourism, MSME, rural development, they have come forward because they have realized the power of culture and not the Ministry of Culture. If we just talk of culture as a goal and just talk of cultural policies, we know, and Stephen also gave examples, it's very difficult to get data and then disaggregated data. We need disaggregated data. And all the countries, they will do the localization of SDG, they will set their own priorities. And we always bear this immense risk of culture being sidelined as being considered for aesthetics value. So this is where, we all really need to come together and share our thoughts clearly with evidence. And of course, culture has that soft power, which I mentioned, say Greta Thunberg, she changed the climate discourse because people believed her. So culture brings in these factors of trust and morality, which is extremely important in shaping and transforming change. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. I think you also highlighted that issue that we should not just be talking to ourselves. It's also about really an engagement with other people. And it's similar to what Stephen has highlighted, that we need to engage in a bigger context and not just speaking to cultural actors as well. So this is the time to discuss. We will have a couple of minutes to engage, and I've seen some points in the chat. There are a lot of them, but if you want to raise your hand and bring up your point, you can let me know. You can wave or use your virtual hand, and I will be able to give the floor to you. But just to get that starting, right? So Ananya has given a point on from the perspective of practice and what it really means to combine different perspectives of culture and tangible heritage or cultural practices together in real life. Stephen has mentioned about advocacy. How difficult is advocacy, and how do we change mindsets? Are we talking to the same people? Is UNESCO the only people that we need to engage, or do we need to engage further out? And then Mike is really showing the different models of culture as part of sustainable development. So colleagues, what are your thoughts on it? I can see, maybe I can start with the easy one first. Ege had a question. Do we endorse the Mondial Conference, or do we say that, we have to, are we just going to talk about cultural policies, or do we go beyond cultural policies and discuss further?
I was just wondering about the declaration. As this is supposed to be quite a historic milestone, Mondial Cult, last year, the resulting declaration might also need, some attention and some promotion. I don't know if we want to take it upon ourselves to promote it, if we agree with everything, but I think we should just have a checkup on that. What happened after Mondial Cult? Was the declaration used much or circulated widely? More of a procedural point, perhaps, but I was curious. Thanks, Gabriel.
What we were told, Stephen can tell more, but what UNESCO was saying was that the civil society can be the hands and feet that can engage and operationalize what it means to be for Mondial, but primarily the conference wanted to have the whole, the member states to endorse it, but it can be a tool for future development of future practice. But are we just going to be the actors who are the feet on the ground, or are we decision makers? That's another question. Klaus Peter, you wanted to say something. Klaus Peter, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I want to highlight one aspect from Stephen about the advocacy. He's right. We should go beyond, of course, we have to go beyond ICOMOS. As you know, Eric Heubrechts and me, we are the focal points for ICOMOS, for UN Habitat and the World Urban Campaign. And it's very hard to highlight these aspects of culture and cultural heritage there, because even the topic sustainable development is a main topic of UN Habitat or World Urban Campaign, but culture and cultural heritage is often forgotten. Thank you.
Correct. Actually, even for colleagues from UN Habitat, the idea that heritage is just one aspect of life, of course, it's not really the main thing. Marie Noel wants to say, react to that.
Hello, thank you. I would say that one thing is that we're lucky in the sense that perhaps we are now in a situation where, even though we are not really happy with the impact we can have, we are listened to a little bit more than maybe a couple of decades ago. One of our challenges, and I think we're all struggling with that, is the how to make things change, how to implement new ideas, new ways of promoting, but also conserving and being very technical in the sense of in the field of urban planning or landscape, which is more my thing, ensuring that it really goes into the nitty-gritty of whatever we're talking about, being policy or guidelines for urban planning or landscape. So that leads us to another point where we need to strengthen our arguments and capacity and be around the table is the economics of it all, ensuring we can be in there. And also training, how training, architect training, town planners, civil engineers, economics, decision makers, blah, blah, blah. That's one thing for advocacy, but also new skills. And as many of us further highlighted, is better taking into account indigenous skills, practices. And again, it has to become part of more general economic framework. Otherwise, it's too small. But it's great. It's great even if it's small, if it's happening, it's fine. But if we want to make it better for heritage culture as a solution, these are areas we need more support and be listened to in capacity. Thanks.
Yeah, correct. That's really on point, Marina. Well, one of the discussions that we had for the expert group meeting on SDG 11 was there were other colleagues, not just the UN agencies, but also different people from different backgrounds on, let's say I had one organization from the blind who was there, and then another one for the aging communities, and another one for social protection. What we presented in a small group about cities and inequalities. And what happened, the guy from social protection was telling us that the cultural sector is an unknown sector to the economy, because during COVID, a lot of people from the cultural sector had went below and really struggled, right? Because much of the financing goes to other sectors, and the cultural sector really shrunk. And I think that is the question that we have, right? For us to be part of the bigger discussion, bigger solutions, how do we contribute? How do we become part of these economic discussions? Maybe it's a starting point with social inclusion, right? Indigenous communities can be part of these conversations. It doesn't need to be about intangible cultural heritage, but it is about the communities that are not really given those services and all. Can be that starting point. I can see some chats, but let me see. You have to raise your hand if you want to say something, because I'm like multitasking. Wait, let me see. Okay, Katie, you wanted to say something. Yes.
Yes, please. I think because I have been working in the government for so long, I am very concerned about how government officials can read culture into policy planning. And usually it comes from economics and how it can be reflected on that. That's what my main concern. I think Mike's approach offers a very interesting way to understand how culture actually works in terms of if it's an adjective, if it works as a noun. And the third, I would say if it works as a verb in order to create and make things happen. And that's very important to be integrated in policy. I think that's something that's tangible and can be used in order to systematize what we need to have an impact with culture in these policies specifically. Because if we get to the abstract aspect and how culture is a part of our relationship with the environment and everything else, we can understand this and try to permeate how the government works and how it allocates budgets. I think that's a very important aspect, how to translate in a very tangible manner. Maybe with these three approaches, it would be a way to systematize it and make it understandable for policymakers.
Oh, thanks.
And according to Mondia quote, just not to extend too much, in terms of if culture is a global public good,
yeah.
that's in part it, because I think it also points out to the economic aspect and how people should have a right of access and to interpret and live culture. I think that's part of what's important to get intertwined in all the discussion.
Thanks, Katie. So I think that really is leading back to economics. Dino is highlighting about the economics as well. I know that you're leaving, but another aspect of this is, you know, that target 11.4.1 is really about the economics of heritage, right? How does private and public contribute to spending in heritage? But the challenge is at least for the heritage sector, is that no one, because it was combined to public and private, it was so difficult for governments to declare. This is also what came out from the expert group meeting, that you know, if we want to know about spending, then for the government, what kind of spending are we talking about? Is it jobs? Is it the management of heritage site? Are we talking about management plans? Is it natural or cultural heritage? All these are like the data that is out there, but it needs to be redefined. Private spending is also so difficult to get. If the private companies don't declare spending, then how do you capture that in you know, the conversations of the SDGs? So I think economics is good, but I think what we need to look at is how to link to other industries as well, as has been highlighted. I actually want to bring up one topic. Ege, you wanted to say something, but I will also want to give the floor later on to Henk, because for Henk, there was a link that they're establishing for water, right? And how do you link water and heritage, which is, for us, we know many of us who are not in ISC water have very little knowledge of it, but actually there's a whole body of knowledge that is about water and the need of water for the common good as well, right? If it's okay, I will give the floor first to Henk, because he wanted to say something. Henk, did you want to say something now?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm not so much on the Mondia cult discussion to make culture an SDG in its own right. We are taking a little different angle. We are talking about the relevance of water-related culture and heritage for today's water management challenges. And that is quite operational. And the point is that we have been asked to do that through our government. ICOMOS has been given funding, and that's also important, because our government is sensitive to bring heritage as a sort of, you can say, assets. It's about assets, already millennia old, not only material, but also governance, and as well as spiritual. It's inspiration from, say, faith traditions, from spiritual domains, from visions, and all that. Vision development is seen as very important, but that has to do with culture as well. Vision development in Indonesia, for example, is a different process than when it is done in the United States or, you know, in Africa. So all these three for us are together. And for New York, we have the UN Water Conference. We have 3 events on schedule. One is a conference where we bring culture, heritage, and also water people together to talk about living heritage. Water people are interested, or are at least to be sensitized, that water-related heritage is living. As Michel Cotte also wrote thematic studies, 2 of them on the Mediterranean and South and Southeast Asia, where he elaborated the notion of living heritage. And that's what people can buy in the water world. And I'm talking about, for example, irrigated terraced rice cultivation in so many mountainous areas. People don't know it in the water world. We are only considering innovation, technical innovation, etc. But how many millions depend on, in their livelihood, you know, on terraced irrigation, for example, which is very traditional? How many millions do depend on For example, spade irrigation in arid areas or in canal systems, underground water distribution systems. There are millions, and they are unknown. They are below the radar institutionally, but also, physically, and even you can say spiritually or in terms of visions. Mm-hmm. And then how many people are living in places like, I call them land, water-related spaces, created by people over millennia in delta areas. So we are going to call to the United Nations, and in particular UNESCO, recognition and more study how many people are actually living in these areas where there is no recognition, to make that a sort of issue at the global level. That's one. And two, also to go towards country level, say develop country level working groups under ICOMOS together with IHP at national level, and consider these points, what in Japan, what in Singapore, what in India, how much living heritage is not on the radar, but is very important for people living in the rural areas, but even in the cities. So these are our points. We have three events. One is the conference where we bring people from the domains together, water and also cultural heritage, culture, etc. The second one is a ceremony at the Water Angel in Central Park, where we bring people from the city, but also federal level, and leaders from religious and spiritual, the UN, communities on religion and spiritual, together around the Water Angel, where we bring a sort of moment of inspiration, but also reconciliation, because there's a lot of conflicts over water, towards the UN, to inspire them with a message, please, of hope. Let's try to have a good meeting which can resolve a number of issues, also taking into account traditional knowledge and all that. And the third one is actually an in-house. We are still waiting in the UN to bring a declaration which will recommend that at UNESCO level, the relation between water and culture and heritage is taken up to sort of further elaborate in the IHP program, and also in the IHP, not only global, but also national, together with ICOMOS national committees. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think that's another...
And thank you, Gabriel, for what you've done to bring us together. And it's beautiful to go there together with Brittany and also to go with Chris. So we are actually covering SDG 6, which was not mentioned earlier on, but we are also there with Brittany on the full scope, and also with Chris on the water. Yeah. And obviously cities, and Brittany will also represent, I'm sure, the urban, and there will also be Laura Petrella from UN Habitat, to also discuss all these things. Yeah, thank you very much for your help.
Thanks. So, Marina was asking how to get more information, so we'll provide more information through that. So, as you know, we're at the SDGs Working Group. I was like looking at different things all at the same time. So, we are supporting ISC Water in that, and it will happen in March. So, more information will be provided to.
I'll send you the program for the program on the Angel.
Yes.
We will also actually issue the shield. There is a water heritage awareness shield that will be handed over to the city in March. I will send you the program. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So, okay, I will take two more interventions, and we unfortunately have to go to the next part of this. So, Ege first, because she raised her hand, and then Anna.
Thank you, Gabe. Just to say something to Hank about SDG 6. Don't worry, in Istanbul, we're in the Cultural Heritage Working Group in the Istanbul Citizens Assembly took SDG 6 very seriously, and they asked on Water Day for a translation of the ICOMOS policy guidance. So that's the first SDG chapter that we translated into Turkish. So SDG 6 is definitely not forgotten. But what I really wanted to say is about this overly economic approach, and connecting that with what Stephen said earlier about speaking the language of the sustainable development policy people. I think maybe the keyword is translation, and not necessarily over financializing things, but measurement and metrics. I think we need to come to data, because what doesn't get measured doesn't really appear. Or there's a saying, I forget now, something about it doesn't get done. So that's another challenge in our sector. Not everything is obviously measurable, but we have been speaking for some years about how to translate again, our qualitative advantages, or what we have to offer that's qualitative, into the language of the quantitative. For example, survey polls we were talking about, how you can measure opinions when something is not in numbers, right? But I think there's a whole lot of things we can do about that. So we need to, without getting stuck or on the concern of over financialization, or getting stuck on the over pillarization of, being somehow trapped into, the machines of the SDGs, we can still translate what we have to offer, the messages, into that format. And I think, there's a balance. I don't think we need to be afraid of that, if that's clear. Thank you.
I think it's really important. Data is so important. If we don't have the data, stories will take us somewhere, but our governments, the decision makers, want the data. So I think part of the engagement for the working group is really publish your work, put some quantitative data out there as well as qualitative data. Anna, and then I wanted, after Anna, I wanted to have a very quick summaries from Ananya, Mike, and Stephen. Can you say about these things? And then we will go to Emmy afterwards. But for the rest of the team, for whoever is here, I want to have a poll, right? The poll is, after these discussions, do you think culture should be a goal or should not be a goal? So I think you can just write in the chat later on if you think culture should be a goal, just as a simple data gathering that we have here. So Anna, please, and then we can go to the three persons. Yeah.
Yes, I think that development is part of our culture, and sustainable development goals, I think, are a part of culture, because culture is the way where we come, is the initial of all our culture, tangible, intangible, and heritage or not, all we live, all our life modified our earth, our plants, climate, all. And as we modified all, we modify, in fact, of our culture. And we have the power to understand and to modify it or not, and how to modify it. Instead of that, I think that culture is bigger than the sustainable development goals, because it's like an umbrella. We can go and think about how, if it's an umbrella that take care of all the others, and the goals need to interchange with culture, what we think, and the culture of our place, or where we live. We have different cultures, and it's different.
Understand.
But, okay.
Oh, sorry, please.
And if are different, the goals, and serve the culture, and the culture need the goals, and they need to interchange. I suppose it's bigger. It's another step we do. The goals is one step, and culture is more than the goals.
I understand. So it's more like a framework. It may not necessarily be a particular goal, but all-encompassing thing.
Yes, but the challenge is how to modify and how to do a sustainable life.
Got it. Thank you very much, Anna. So I think I do have, I want to have 1 minute for each, and then we will have to really go to Emmy. Ananya, what are your thoughts from what we've heard?
I'd like to stress that we're not talking of only the economic value here. We're really talking of the other values which culture is bringing in. We should not just talk of economic value, because then, the problem which happened in the previous set, they just spoke of cultural tourism and creative economy. So, the whole essence is, how to learn from culture, how to use culture to achieve the SDG goals. So my vote is yes, but not only for cultural policies, but the transversal. And the commons approach, which I highlighted also, is very important, because that is how communities are addressing. So I think the knowledge which communities have, now it's not right to say we don't have data. We know about all this. There are enough researches. The moment we are talking of only economic, then all these data issues will come in. But we know there is absence of laws. We know there are absence of laws in various countries. Laws, bylaws, local legislations, which will help support, appropriate conservation practices. We know that there is no process of ensuring that communities' voice is heard. That is why polycentric governance is so important, particularly when we are in an era of, supra-diversity. Culture now has several dimensions in all the places across the world. So I think with that, I agree.
I totally agree with that. So it's not the culture as a goal. It's not just, it's only a step, but there's so many different things that needs to be done as well. Stephen, I'm asking people like you and Mike, 1 minute from what you've heard. So Stephen, I give the floor to you. 1 minute.
Yeah, so I don't know, I get these like openings rather than sort of grand conclusions. I think that the whole discussion about economics is super interesting. I know it's very easy to describe economics as being just about sort of World Bank and like micro stuff and forcing people to cut back when there's high inflation and so on. I think that there's an interesting angle in there. I don't know, there's a lot of economics that is friendly to us. Behavioral economics is potentially is extremely sexy right now in a lot of sectors, and that is arguably heavily linked to cultural factors. So I don't know. I think there's a question there about how can we articulate what we're doing in terms that don't look anti-economic. I don't know. There's plenty of people in this space calling for the end of capitalism and so on. And like, let's be realistic, that's not going to happen. But I don't know. Think about how we articulate in a way that stays, I don't know, true to the values of what we're going for. I think there's also, and this is going to be a task for the Culture 2030 Goal Group, what do indicators look like? I know we've all been very much trained to think about indicators in terms of specific outputs and countables. That's obviously a very difficult thing to do. A lot of the current SDG indicators are about process, because you can be legitimate because the process you follow is correct. So what do sort of indicators of effective processes that incorporate culture look like? But I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had there to make sure that we don't end up, and paraphrasing what Ege was saying, we need indicators that, I don't know, are realistic and are honest, but we also sort of need indicators to mean that we don't end up not measuring, we're not treasuring what we don't measure. Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. So we yes, so it's about economics, but actually I think other people are just saying that there's a social component to it that we also have to think about, and the other aspects of sustainable development as well. Mike, final word, 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm challenging whether we're actually doing more of the same. In other words, we have to say we're going to have more goals and more goals. I think the world has got to stand up and say there's going to be something else. Perhaps we're going to have ambitions instead of goals. And I think that we need to then move the system out of more goals and measuring these things. So that's my first point, which I want to say. The second point is that if there is goals, if there's not goals, what's the alternative? So it's not a binary whether I want it or not want it, but in fact, what is the alternative? If I have an alternative, then I want both. I feel like a child in a toy shop. So I think that, but if I was to put my first point in, I think that we shouldn't have a goal for it, but I shouldn't have goal for anything. I should have ambitions, and I should then put them all together. And the new sustainable goals from 2030 should be completely rethought out. And I think this is where we can then make the difference also through mass technology with data science. We're just managing everything in such a different way. The potential for measuring, as Ega said, is going to be absolutely mind-boggling.
Amazing. So I think that is a thought-provoking question. So how do we go beyond the goals and break that kind of cycle and create a new type of paradigm? So I think, do we need a goal? So I think that's
and we as culture, the people who can force this debate, to my mind.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think we are agents of that change, and I think I will have to leave that here. It is very, very interesting, but this is a starting point. We have a long way to go. There's 7 years to go for the agenda, but we need to think about it. What is our contribution to that in terms of ICOMOS, in terms of people from the cultural sector, and then influence others who are part of the whole system, and engaging with other people as well. If you have any questions, do there's Anasha is for internships, but for this one, Task Team 2 is about Brittany. Get in touch with Brittany and myself, and that's it for today. So thank you very much. Wonderful conversation. We have 50 people that came in today. It's quite amazing, and we will see each other again mid of March, and have a good weekend to everyone, wherever you are around the world.